Hey everyone. There's a question that some people ask when they get to into cover crops, especially starting out. Often a lot of the advice is start with cereal rye. It's easy, you can plant it real late, and it just has a lot of other benefits with it. But then the next question is, how late can you actually plant cereal rye? So we have on our farm, because of a variety of circumstances, cereal rye that was planted at vastly different times this last fall. So we have some that was planted end of September, beginning of October, kind of that time frame. We also have some that was planted in early January, and actually I think I'm just going to go toss some out. There was a spot that the weather didn't allow me to get some in. I'm going to toss some out here. It is now just about the end of February, last week or two of February. And I'll show you where things are at right now as things are thawing out a little bit at the end of February. And I'll also show you after a little while, as we get closer to planting time, what the growth difference is based on planting time in the fall. So here we're at a field. This was a cornfield that we have, and this was one of the last fields that we got harvested. And then the rye was planted right around Thanksgiving time. It was right about probably the 24th of November. So I think it might have even been Thanksgiving Day or the day after. So now here at end of February, how much growth does the rye have? Well, let's take a look and see what we can find. So we've had a very mild winter, which is definitely helpful. And rye is something that doesn't take a whole lot to grow. Well, you can see we've got some cocklebur seeds here, so that was one of the issues this field had. But there is a rye seed that is coming up. This rye was planted about an inch deep or so, maybe a little bit deeper than what it needed to be for being planted so late. So there's another rye seed. There's some more rye that's coming up. So you can see that the rye, when planted late November, there's another one little coming up. Planted late November is going to actually grow through the winter a little bit. I'll maybe see if I can dig some up. We'll see what kind of roots we have with this rye. Okay, I was able to dig some rye up here. We've got the rye plants, we've got the roots extending down a few inches. So it does have some growth, even though it was winter. And yes, it was a little bit more of a mild winter. That rye, even though we saw it was just poking out of the ground, still has a decent amount of roots for being so cold. So even though you don't necessarily see a lot of above ground, it is putting some, see there's the roots there, putting some growth below ground. That's not going to be enough to really do a lot for erosion control, but it is going to help to be feeding some of the biology that's down there. So obviously, in an ideal situation, this would have been maybe aerial seeded, or in some way we would have tried to get the rye growing earlier than what we did. But this is just to show you how late you can maybe plant rye, and we'll look after another month or two. Maybe I'll do a few in between about what that growth ends up being in terms of cover in the spring. So we'll go over and we'll take a look at some of the fields that were planted in early October and just see the difference in growth that about 1 month or a month and a half in the fall makes, especially when it comes to cereal rye. So we're actually a couple days later. I didn't get over here the same day, but I did want to show you this field that was planted into rye on October 1st. So let's look at it real quick here, and I'll point out a few things that I can notice right away. So obviously this rye is a lot further along than that rye that we just saw that was planted at the end of November. So that's what 2 months difference in the fall in northern Illinois can do. We had originally planted, this ground was lightly tilled, and then this rye was seeded. We were thinking maybe we would try to roller crimp this rye if we got a good enough establishment. It was a possibility. So we seeded this very heavy. It was seeded well over 100, I can't remember exactly, maybe close to 150 pounds to the acre, but it was still seeded slightly late for a roller crimp setting. You can see if I just look down, there's all these spots where there is dirt showing. The rye has not tillered. This is 7.5 inch spacing. but it is not quite early enough planted to have good coverage. And as we get closer to spring, as the ground warms up, you can already see we've got winter annuals that are starting to come up. All those spots of soil are opportunities for giant ragweed to get started, opportunities for foxtail to get started. So this field, even though we planted it really heavy and it wasn't that late, October 1st isn't, it's slightly ahead of our average first frost date, that rye might not be thick enough to actually suppress weeds in an organic no-till system. But obviously this rye is established well enough that if this was a little bit steeper hill, we'd have some really good erosion control going on there. This is obviously thicker, just kind of giving some good coverage of the ground, roots working in there. So it definitely is doing more being planted 2 months earlier compared to the stuff that was planted at the end of November. So I just wanted to show you just real quick, yes, obviously planting date for cereal rye, especially as you're a little bit further north, does make a significant difference. But as we'll see here, I'll come back in another month or two, you can see what that later planted rye actually did. And we'll be able to see, okay, what kind of a benefit can you get if it's January 1st, if it's even February, if I just throw out some seed, is it gonna do me any good or not? We'll take a look at that, see if it is worth the time and effort of doing it. Obviously, ideal situation, you would be able to seed nice and early, end of September into October. It would have been interesting if we could have done a little bit more delayed, planting every 2 weeks or something, just to see, get a better visual of that. But this is what we got. We have something that's the beginning of October. We've got an end of November. I've got some that's the end of December, beginning of January. And so we'll just update you as we go along here and show you how much of a difference it makes on planting date of cereal rye. Is it even worth it to put out late? And we'll see what we find as we get into spring.